You think you know the old man who quietly tends to the WWII Memorial Plaza, the one who spends his days polishing name plaques and sharing stories with visitors, the one whose gentle smile masks decades of service in the skies. What if I told you that this unassuming veteran was once one of the most skilled combat pilots the Air Force had ever seen, a man whose mere presence in the cockpit would strike fear into enemy squadrons? David "Eagle Eye" Mitchell isn't just any retired airman. He's a living legend whose past is better left in the clouds, until now. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of the WWII Memorial Plaza, where David Mitchell stood before the curved wall of bronze plaques, his weathered hands tracing the engraved names of fallen airmen. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders as he performed his daily ritual of maintenance and remembrance. At 72, he moved with a deliberate grace that betrayed his military bearing, despite the years that had passed since his last mission. The plaza was quiet at this hour, the marble pathways still cool from the night air. David adjusted one of the fresh flower arrangements near the central monument, his movements precise and measured. To the casual observer, he was just another volunteer, an elderly veteran paying his respects to fallen comrades. But beneath his calm exterior lay the sharp mind of a man who had orchestrated some of the most daring aerial operations in modern military history. The sound of motorcycle engines in the distance barely registered as David continued his morning routine. The plaza would often attract visitors of all kinds, families paying respects, veterans seeking solace, and occasionally, motorcycle groups on their cross-country rides. He had grown accustomed to the variety of visitors, each bringing their own reasons for visiting this sacred ground. But something about these approaching engines seemed different. The aggressive revving, the disruptive rhythm of multiple bikes accelerating unnecessarily. It spoke of disrespect, of trouble brewing on the horizon. David's instincts, honed through countless hours of combat flight, began to stir. His hands stilled on the polishing cloth as he listened, calculating distance and direction just as he once tracked incoming bogies on radar. The motorcycles rounded the corner, 5 of them, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. They cut across the dedicated parking area, ignoring the clearly marked spaces, and came to a stop directly in front of the memorial's main entrance. The riders, clad in leather, adorned with patches that spoke more of wannabe tough guys than actual military service, dismounted with an air of ownership that made David's jaw tighten. Their leader, a tall man with a scraggly beard and arms covered in tacky military-themed tattoos, swaggered toward the Memorial Plaza, his boots scuffing against the ceremonial brick pathway that so many veterans had walked with reverence. David watched as the man casually flicked a cigarette onto the immaculate grounds, the still-burning butt landing near a fresh floral tribute. "Hey, old-timer," the leader called out, his voice carrying the artificial gruffness of someone trying too hard to sound intimidating. "This where they keep all the war stories? Must get boring, babysitting a bunch of names on a wall." David didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to carefully pick up the discarded cigarette and dispose of it properly. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, reminiscent of the way he used to perform his pre-flight checks, thorough, methodical, and always in control. The rest of the gang spread out across the plaza, their leather boots echoing off the memorial walls. One of them leaned against the wall of honor, his greasy hair brushing against names that had been etched with reverence and respect. Another began picking at the fresh flowers, laughing as petals scattered across the ground. "You deaf, old man," the leader pressed, moving closer. "Or just too scared to talk?" David finally turned to face them, his steel blue eyes carrying the same intensity that had once tracked enemy aircraft through storm clouds and combat zones. "The memorial opens to the public at 9, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that had once commanded entire squadrons. "You're welcome to return then, if you can manage to show proper respect." The leader's face darkened at the subtle rebuke. He stepped closer, trying to use his height advantage to intimidate. "Respect? Let me tell you something about respect, Grandpa. This is our country, our rules. We go where we want, when we want. David's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in his stance, a subtle adjustment that any trained combat veteran would recognize as preparation. His mind automatically ran through scenarios, just as it had during countless combat situations. He noted exit routes, positions of advantage, potential weapons of opportunity. Old habits died hard. "Son," David said, the word carrying no warmth, "you're standing on ground that's been consecrated by the sacrifice of better men than you'll ever be. I'm giving you one chance to leave this place as you found it. After that, things get complicated." The gang members exchanged looks, amusement mixing with growing anger. Their leader stepped even closer, now just inches from David's face. "Or, what, old-timer? You gonna call the cops? Or maybe you think you can take us all on yourself?" David's lips curved into a slight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes remained focused, alert, carrying the same deadly precision that had once guided him through the world's most dangerous airspace. The morning sun caught his Air Force veteran's pin, sending a glint of light across the plaza, a small reminder of the years he'd spent defending everything this memorial represented. The tension in the air thickened as both sides measured each other, the quiet of the memorial grounds now charged with the electricity of impending confrontation. What these riders didn't realize was that they hadn't just challenged some elderly caretaker, they had awakened something far more dangerous. David Eagle Eye Mitchell might have left the cockpit years ago, but the warrior within him had never truly retired. The leader of the riders, who called himself Razor, circled David like a predator sizing up prey. His leather jacket creaked with each movement, patches depicting skulls and flames catching the morning light. The other gang members spread out, their boots scuffing against the memorial's polished stone floor, leaving dirty marks that made David's jaw clench. "You know what I think?" Razor sneered, his voice echoing off the memorial walls. "I think you're just another washed-up vet who can't let go of the past. These walls, these names, they don't mean anything anymore. It's all just ancient history." David remained motionless, his eyes tracking each rider's position with the same precision he once used to monitor enemy aircraft formations. The morning. Sun cast long shadows across the plaza, and in those shadows, David could almost see the ghosts of his fallen comrades watching, waiting. "You ever fly, tough guy?" David asked quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had commanded squadrons through the worst kinds of storms. "Ever had to make split-second decisions at Mach 2, with enemy missiles locked on your 6? Razor laughed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What's that got to do with anything, old-timer? We're not in the sky now. We're right here on the ground, and there's 5 of us and 1 of you." One of the other riders, a younger man with a patchy beard and too many rings on his fingers, approached a wall of medals and commendations displayed behind protective glass. He tapped the glass with his knuckles, the sound sharp and disrespectful, in the quiet morning air. "Look at all this shiny junk," the young rider called out. "Bet these would fetch a good price somewhere." His fingers traced the edge of the display case, looking for weakness. David's eyes narrowed slightly. These weren't just medals behind that glass. They were symbols of sacrifice, courage, and loss. Each one represented a story, a mission, a life changed or lost in service to something greater than themselves. "Those medals," David said, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before, "belonged to men who gave everything for this country. Men who understood honor, duty, and sacrifice, something you clearly know nothing about." Another rider, tall and lanky with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, spat on the ground. "Honor? Duty? That's just propaganda they feed guys like you, to make you feel better about being government puppets." David's mind flashed back to a mission over hostile territory, his F-15 Eagle threading through anti-aircraft fire while protecting a wounded wingman. He remembered the weight of responsibility, the clarity of purpose, the absolute trust between pilots who knew their lives depended on each other. "You want to talk about propaganda?" David asked, taking a step forward. "Let's talk about those patches on your jackets. Playing dress-up as tough guys, disrespecting a memorial to real warriors. That's what I call propaganda." Razor's face darkened with rage. He grabbed David's shirt collar, pulling him close. "You better watch your mouth, old man. We're not just some bunch of riders you can lecture. We're the real deal." David didn't resist the grab, but his body tensed imperceptibly. Years of combat training had taught him patience, taught him to wait for the right moment. His hands remained relaxed at his sides, but his mind was already calculating angles, distances, potential moves, just as he once calculated flight paths and engagement vectors. The real deal? David's voice was quiet, almost contemplative. "Let me tell you something about the real deal. In combat, at 40,000 feet, there's no room for pretense, no time for fake tough guy acts. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and you're nothing but a fireball in the sky." The other riders had drawn closer now, forming a tight circle around David and their leader. They thought they were being intimidating, but all they'd done was put themselves exactly where David wanted them, within reach, their movements restricted by their own numbers. "When you're up there," David continued, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if he were seeing something far beyond the memorial plaza, everything becomes crystal clear. You learn real quick who's genuine and who's just playing at being a warrior. Razor's grip on David's collar tightened. "Shut up. You think your war stories scare us? You're nothing but a relic, old man. Times have changed." David's eyes locked onto Razor's, and for the first time, the gang leader saw something in those steel-blue depths that made him hesitate. Something cold, calculating, and absolutely certain. It was the look of a man who had stared death in the face at supersonic speeds and hadn't blinked. "You're right about one thing," David said softly. "Times have changed. But principles haven't. Respect, honor, courage. They mean the same thing they always have. And right now, you're standing on sacred ground, disrespecting everything those principles stand for." The tension in the air had become almost unbearable, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. The other riders shifted uneasily, sensing that something was about to happen, something they hadn't planned for. They had come expecting to intimidate an old man, but now they found themselves facing someone who radiated a quiet, lethal confidence they didn't understand. David's fingers flexed slightly, muscle memory from countless hours in the cockpit preparing him for what might come next. He had never wanted another fight. His war days were supposed to be behind him. But standing there, surrounded by men who would desecrate this sacred place, he knew some battles still needed to be fought. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays catching the polished stone of the memorial walls, reflecting off the glass cases protecting precious medals and memories. In that gleaming light, David Eagle Eye Mitchell stood ready, a guardian not just of bronze plaques and marble monuments, but of everything they represented. Razor released David's collar with a shove, clearly expecting the older man to stumble backward. Instead, David shifted his weight slightly, absorbing the push with the same stability that had once helped him handle 9G maneuvers in his F-15. His feet remained planted, solid as the memorial walls behind him. "You got some nerve, old-timer," Razor snarled, his confidence wavering slightly at David's unwavering stance. "Acting like you own this place, like these walls mean something special. It's just stone and metal." David's eyes flickered to the E. Young rider still examining the metal display case, noting how his fingers were now probing the edges more intentionally. The memories surfaced unbidden, the mission that had earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross displayed in that very case. The night raid over hostile territory, guiding a damaged transport plane through heavy fire, ensuring 32 soldiers made it home alive. "Every name on these walls," David said, his voice carrying the weight of years in the cockpit. "Every medal in that case represents something you couldn't begin to understand. Moments where men and women faced their fears and did what needed to be done. The snake-tattooed rider moved closer, attempting to flank David. Big words from an old man, but words don't mean much when you're outnumbered. A faint smile crossed David's face, remembering similar odds. His F-15 against 3 enemy fighters, low on fuel, deep in hostile airspace. Numbers hadn't mattered then either. "You know what we learned in combat flight training?" David asked, his voice conversational but his eyes sharp as ever. "When you're outnumbered, that just means you've got multiple targets to choose from." The gang members exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't going according to their plan. The key old veteran was supposed to be intimidated, supposed to back down in fear. Instead, he stood before them with the calm confidence of a man who had faced far worse odds and emerged victorious. Razor, attempting to regain control of the situation, reached for David's shoulder. "Enough of this military bull!" Before he could finish his sentence, David moved. It was a pilot's movement. Economical, precise, years of cockpit discipline translated into physical action. His hand caught Razor's wrist, redirecting the grab with the same fluid efficiency he once used to maneuver his aircraft through combat zones. Razor found himself suddenly off balance, his arm locked in a position that sent shooting pain through his shoulder. He tried to pull away, but David's grip was like iron, forged by years of handling flight controls under extreme G-forces. "What the hell?" Razor gasped, genuine fear creeping into his voice for the first time. "In aerial combat," David said calmly, maintaining the hold, "position is everything. Right now, you're in a flat spin, son, and you don't even realize it yet." The other riders, seeing their leader in distress, started to move in. But David had already anticipated their response, just as he used to anticipate enemy fighter maneuvers. He shifted, using Razor's own body as a barrier between himself and the approaching gang members. "Back off!" Razor commanded his men, his face contorted in pain. "This old man's got some kind of crazy grip." David's voice remained steady, almost instructional. "It's not about strength. It's about leverage, timing, and knowing exactly where to apply pressure. Just like threading an aircraft through a missile lock. It's all about understanding the dynamics of the situation." The young rider near the medal case had abandoned his exploration of its weaknesses, now fully focused on the unexpected turn of events. The snake-tattooed man had backed away slightly, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of David's controlled expertise. "You still want to talk about ancient history?" David asked, slightly adjusting his grip as Razor tried to squirm free. "About things that don't matter anymore? Because right now, you're learning a very current lesson about respect." Through the windows of the memorial hall, the morning sun had fully risen, illuminating the scene in harsh clarity. The polished floors reflected the struggle, creating multiple shadows that danced across the hallowed walls. The names of fallen airmen seemed to watch the confrontation unfold, silent witnesses to this modern defense of their sanctuary. "Let me go," Razor said, his voice now more plea than command. "We'll leave, okay? Just let me go." David held the hold for a moment longer, letting the message sink in. Then, with the same controlled precision that had marked his entire career, he released Razor's wrist. The gang leader stumbled back, rubbing his shoulder, his face a mixture of pain, humiliation, and dawning respect. "This place," David said, straightening his jacket with military precision, "deserves better than your disrespect. These men and women gave everything so people like you could have the freedom to ride around playing tough guy. The least you can do is honor their sacrifice." The other riders had backed away, forming a loose semicircle around their chastened leader. The swagger was gone from their stance, replaced by uncertainty and a growing understanding that they had severely underestimated the elderly veteran before them. David's eyes swept across the group, carrying the same authoritative gaze that had once commanded attention during mission briefings. "Now I believe we discuss the proper visiting hours. 9 o'clock, if you can manage to show appropriate respect. Otherwise, I suggest you find somewhere else to spend your morning." The riders hesitated, their earlier confidence shattered by the unexpected display of skill and authority. Razor straightened up, trying to regain some semblance of dignity despite his throbbing shoulder. His eyes darted between his gang members, searching for support, but finding only uncertainty in their expressions. "This isn't over, old man," Razor muttered, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You think you can just humiliate us and walk away?" David remained motionless, his posture relaxed but alert, reminiscent of the ready stance he'd maintained during countless pre-flight checks. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a seasoned flight commander, "that's exactly what's going to happen. Because deep down, you know you're in over your head." The young rider with the rings nervously backed away from the medal display case, his earlier bravado replaced by something approaching shame. The morning light caught the engravings on the medals, each one telling a story of courage and sacrifice that now seemed to carry more weight than before. "You got lucky, that's all," the snake-tattooed rider called out, but he kept his distance, respect and fear warring in his eyes. "Next time." "There won't be a next time," David cut him off, his tone sharp as a fighter jet's wings. "Because next time, I won't be so gentle. You see what you just experienced? That was me being polite. 20 years in the cockpit teaches you a lot about handling hostile situations with minimum force." David's mind flashed back to his days as a flight instructor, teaching young pilots the delicate balance between aggression and control. The same principles applied here. Show enough force to establish dominance, but maintain the discipline to avoid unnecessary escalation. Razor, still massaging his wrist, took a step back toward his motorcycle. "Come on, boys. This place isn't worth our time anyway." But his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes kept darting to David as if trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. "Before you go," David said, his voice carrying across the Memorial Plaza, "take a good look around. Look at these names, these medals, these memories. Each one represents someone who understood what it means to stand for something bigger than themselves." The riders, despite their attempt to maintain their tough facade, found themselves involuntarily glancing at the walls, the names, the symbols of sacrifice that surrounded them. For a moment, the morning silence was heavy with the weight of history. "You wear those patches, those symbols of rebellion," David continued, gesturing to their jackets. "But the real rebels, they're the ones on these walls, the ones who faced down real threats, who put everything on the line for what they believed in. That's the kind of courage worth remembering." A slight breeze rustled through the plaza, carrying with it the distant sound of birds and the growing bustle of the city beyond. The memorial grounds seemed to come alive with the morning light, each shadow and reflection telling its own story of valor and sacrifice. Razor mounted his bike, his movements stiff with lingering pain and wounded pride. "Let's roll," he commanded, but his voice had lost its edge of authority. His gang followed suit, their engines starting up with less enthusiasm than before. As they prepared to leave, David noticed something in their posture, their expressions, a subtle shift that spoke of more than just defeat. There was recognition there, perhaps even the beginning of understanding. They had come expecting to find an easy target, a relic of the past to mock and intimidate. Instead, they had encountered something they hadn't known existed. A warrior who carried his strength not in patches or poses, but in the quiet confidence of someone who had faced real battles. "Remember this moment," David called out as they started their engines. "Remember what it feels like to stand in the presence of true sacrifice. Maybe next time you'll think twice about where you choose to show your disrespect." The riders pulled away from the memorial, their departure markedly more subdued than their arrival. The roar of their engines faded into the distance, leaving behind only the peaceful quiet of the Memorial Plaza and the lingering echo of a lesson learned the hard way. David watched them go, his tactical mind noting their departure vectors just as he once tracked bogies leaving his airspace. When the last sound of their motorcycles had faded, he turned back to the memorial walls, his fingers once again finding the familiar names etched in bronze. "Still standing watch, aren't we?" He murmured to the names of his fallen comrades. The morning sun caught his Air Force pin again, sending another flash of light across the plaza, a silent acknowledgement between warriors past and present. He resumed his morning routine, polishing the plaques and straightening the flowers, but his movements now carried an added weight of purpose. The memorial wasn't just a place of remembrance. It was a sanctuary that deserved protection, a legacy that needed guardians who understood its true value. David "Eagle Eye" Mitchell had long ago left the cockpit, but he had never stopped being a defender of what mattered most. The skills that had once protected his nation in the skies above now served to protect the memory of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Different battlefield, same warrior spirit. The peace at WWII Memorial Plaza didn't last long. As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, the distant rumble of motorcycles returned, louder this time, more aggressive. David recognized the sound immediately, the distinctive roar of bikes pushed to their limits, engines screaming with pent-up rage and wounded pride. Never could resist a second pass, David muttered to himself, remembering countless dogfights, where enemy pilots made the fatal mistake of returning for another engagement. His hands remained steady as he continued polishing a bronze plaque, but his senses heightened, just as they used to in the cockpit when radar picked up incoming bogies. This time, the riders came in force. Not just the original 5, but at least a dozen more, their chrome gleaming in the late morning sun. Their engines echoed off the memorial walls as they surrounded the plaza, cutting off all obvious escape routes. David noted their positioning with the same tactical awareness he'd once used to track multiple bandits in combat. Razor led the pack, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and determination. His right arm, the one David had locked earlier, was held slightly stiff, a tell that brought a faint smile to the veteran's face. Behind their leader, the new riders revved their engines, creating a wall of noise that disrupted the sacred quiet of the memorial grounds. "Brought some friends, I see," David said calmly, carefully replacing the polishing cloth in his pocket. "Guess the lesson didn't quite sink in the first time." "You think you're so smart, old man," Razor snarled, dismounting his bike. "Think you can embarrass me in front of my crew and just walk away? Well, this time we're going to teach you about respect." David's eyes scanned the group, automatically calculating threats and positions. 17 riders, he noted aloud, his voice carrying the same analytical tone he'd used during mission briefings. 2 carrying concealed weapons, judging by their stance. 3 former military, based on their bearing, though not very high-ranking, given their poor discipline. The precision of his assessment caused several riders to shift uncomfortably. One of the new arrivals, a massive man with a shaved head, leaned over to Razor. "You sure about this, boss? Something ain't right about this old-timer." "Shut up," Razor snapped, but David caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He just got lucky before. Now we show him what happens when you mess with the wrong people. David took a step forward, his movements measured and deliberate. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the plaza, stretching toward the approaching riders like a warning. "You know what we used to call it in the Air Force when someone made the same mistake twice. We called it target fixation, getting so focused on what you want to hit that you don't see the danger until it's too late." Several of the riders had spread out, trying to encircle him. David noted their positions without turning his head, his peripheral vision honed by years of scanning radar displays and checking 6, tracking every movement. They thought they were being tactical, but to his experienced eye, they were just making themselves predictable. "Last chance," David announced, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded squadron briefings. "Leave this sacred ground, or find out why they called me Eagle Eye in the service." A younger rider, eager to prove himself, rushed forward with a length of chain. David moved with the smoothness of a well-maintained aircraft responding to controls. His hand caught the chain mid-swing, wrapping it around his forearm in a fluid motion that pulled the younger man off balance. Before anyone could react, the rider was on the ground, his own weapon used to pin him firmly but carefully. "That's one," David said calmly, as if marking off a pre-flight checklist. "Who's next?" The plaza erupted into chaos as several riders charged forward simultaneously. But David was already moving, his decades of combat training translating ground warfare into familiar terms. Each attacker became a bogey, each angle of approach a vector to be calculated and countered. He slipped between two rushing attackers, causing them to collision with each other. Bogeys 3 and 4 merged, before redirecting a punch from a third into the stomach of a fourth. His movements were precise, efficient, without wasted energy or showmanship. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about protecting what mattered. "Getting sloppy with your formation," David commented as he sidestepped another attack, his voice still carrying that instructor's tone. "Bunching up like this creates a target-rich environment, basic tactical error." The remaining riders hesitated, watching in growing disbelief as their companions were systematically neutralized by what they had assumed would be an easy target. David stood in their midst, his breathing controlled and steady, just as it had been during his most intense aerial engagements. Behind them, the memorial walls seemed to watch the confrontation unfold, the names of fallen heroes bearing witness to this modern defense of their sanctuary. The morning sun caught the polished stone, creating reflections that danced across the plaza like the flashes of distant aircraft. Razor, watching his reinforcements falter, felt the last threads of his control slipping away. The old veteran wasn't just holding his own. He was systematically dismantling every advantage they thought they had. Each movement, each counter, spoke of years of combat experience that went far beyond anything they had expected. "Don't just stand there," Razor shouted at his remaining men. "He's just one old man. Take him down." David's lips curved into a slight smile, the same one he used to wear when enemy pilots fell for his aerial traps. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about numbers. It's about skill, discipline, and purpose. Everything you're lacking." 3. More riders charged forward, trying to overwhelm him with sheer mass. David moved like he was still in the cockpit, each action smooth and deliberate. He redirected the first attacker's momentum into the second, then used their confusion to neutralize the third with a precise strike to the solar plexus. "In air combat," David explained, his voice remaining steady despite the exertion, "you learn to use your opponent's energy against them. The bigger they come, the harder they fall, especially when they don't know how to control their own momentum." The bald-headed rider who had earlier expressed doubt now stood back, watching with growing respect and fear. "Boss, this ain't right. This ain't no regular vet. Look at how he moves." David's attention never wavered from the threats around him, but his mind flashed back to his days as a combat instructor, teaching young pilots the art of aerial warfare. "You want to know why I'm different? Because I spent 20 years making split-second decisions at Mach 2, where mistakes meant death. This is slow motion compared to that." A chain whistled through the air toward his head, but David was already moving, ducking under the attack with the same precision he once used to evade incoming missiles. His hand shot out, catching the chain and yanking it forward, sending its wielder sprawling. "Every morning," David continued, his voice carrying across the plaza, "I come here to honor the men and women who gave everything for something bigger than themselves. People who understood duty, sacrifice, and respect." He paused, looking directly at Razor. "And I will not let their memory be disrespected by thugs playing at being tough guys." The remaining riders began to back away, their earlier bravado replaced by a growing understanding that they were hopelessly outmatched. Even their superior numbers meant nothing against David's experience and skill. "You're insane," one of them muttered, helping a fallen comrade to his feet. "What are you, some kind of super soldier?" David shook his head, his expression serious. "No. Just a pilot who learned that the most important battles aren't fought in the air. They're fought wherever good men and women need to stand up for what's right. Razor, seeing his backup plan crumbling, made one last desperate move. He pulled a knife from his jacket, its blade catching the sunlight. "Let's see how tough you are against this, old man." But before he could even step forward, David was there, moving with the same deadly efficiency that had made him legendary in the Air Force. His hand caught Razor's wrist, applying pressure to exactly the right point. The knife clattered to the ground as Razor let out a yelp of pain. "You know what the difference is between you and me?" David asked, maintaining the hold with practiced ease. "I've faced real threats, real enemies, people who wanted to kill me and everything I stood for. You're just a playground bully who picked the wrong playground." The last of the fight seemed to drain from Razor's face as he realized just how completely he had misread the situation. His men were scattered, some nursing injuries, others simply standing in stunned silence. "These walls," David continued, gradually releasing his hold, "they mean something. Every name, every story, every sacrifice. They deserve better than your disrespect. They deserve to be honored, remembered, protected." The morning had grown warmer, the sun now high enough to eliminate the last shadows from the plaza. The memorial stones seemed to glow with an inner light, as if the spirits of fallen warriors were adding their own strength to David's defense of their resting place. "Now," David said, his voice carrying the weight of command, "you're going to leave this place, and you're going to remember what happened here. Not because I hurt you, which I could have, but because I showed you what real strength looks like. The kind that comes from fighting for something worth protecting." The riders began to retreat to their bikes, helping their injured companions. The rumble of engines starting up was subdued now, lacking the aggressive revving from before. One by one, they began to pull away from the plaza, leaving behind their illusions of dominance and invincibility. Razor was the last to mount his bike, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. Finally, he simply nodded, a small gesture, but one that carried a glimmer of understanding. As the last motorcycle roared away from the plaza, David stood among the scattered evidence of the confrontation, a dropped chain here, a fallen patch there. His breathing remained steady, controlled, just as it had been during his most intense aerial engagements. The memorial grounds, momentarily transformed into a battlefield, began to settle back into their natural state of reverent quiet. David walked slowly around the plaza, picking up the debris left behind by the riders. Each item he collected was handled with the same meticulous care he once gave to his pre-flight inspections. Nothing would be left to mar the dignity of this sacred place. "You always did have a way of handling trouble, Eagle Eye," came a familiar voice from behind him. David turned to see James Cooper, another Air Force veteran who volunteered at the memorial, walking toward him. James had served as a crew chief during David's flying days, keeping the Eagles in top condition for their combat missions. "You saw all that, did you, Chief?" David asked, straightening up with a handful of scattered items. James nodded, moving to help clean up. "Caught the whole show from the security office. Could have called the police. You know." David's eyes scanned the horizon, an old habit from his flying days. "Sometimes the police take too long. Sometimes you have to handle things yourself." He paused, looking at the memorial walls. Besides, they needed a different kind of lesson. Still, "The same Mitchell," James chuckled, but his eyes were serious. "Taking on overwhelming odds, making it look easy. Just like that time over Baghdad when you took on those 4 MiGs by yourself." David's mind flashed back to that mission, the radar warnings screaming in his ears, the G-forces crushing him into his seat as he outmaneuvered multiple bandits. This was different, Chief. Back then we were fighting for our lives. Today, we were fighting for something else. Together they walked the grounds, restoring order to the plaza. James watched as David carefully straightened a flower arrangement that had been knocked askew during the confrontation. The precision in his movements hadn't changed since his flying days. "You know they might come back," James said quietly. "Types like that, they don't like being shown up." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "They might. But they'll be different next time. You saw their faces at the end. Something got through to them. Something about this place, about what it represents." The morning had fully bloomed now, the sun high enough to illuminate every corner of the memorial. Visitors would be arriving soon, families and veterans coming to pay their respects, unaware of the battle that had just been fought to protect the sanctity of their shrine. "It's like you used to say in the squadron," James recalled, helping to reset a knocked-over bench. "The best victory is the one that changes the enemy's mind, not just their direction." David smiled at the memory. He had taught that principle to countless young pilots, trying to instill in them the understanding that combat wasn't just about destroying targets. It was about achieving objectives, about protecting what mattered. "They came here thinking this was just a place of stone and metal," David said, gesturing to the memorial walls. "They didn't understand that these walls hold something more powerful than their attempts at intimidation. They hold our history, our sacrifice, our honor." A gentle breeze swept through the plaza, rustling the fresh flowers and carrying with it the distant sounds of the city awakening. David paused in his work, his hand resting on one of the memorial plaques. The name, under his fingers, belonged to his first wingman, lost during a mission over hostile territory. "You know what I see when I look at these walls, Chief?" David asked, his voice taking on the quiet intensity he used to reserve for mission briefings. "I see the faces of every pilot I ever flew with, every brave soul who took to the skies, knowing they might not come back. This isn't just a memorial, it's a testament to courage itself." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And that's why you'll never stop defending it." "Exactly," David replied, straightening up with military precision. "Because someone has to stand guard, has to remind people what these names mean, what they represent. Sometimes that reminder comes through stories and ceremonies, and sometimes it comes through showing them what a real warrior looks like," James finished, a knowing smile on his face. The plaza was almost back to normal now, all signs of the confrontation erased. But something had changed in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that spoke of battles fought and lessons learned. The memorial stood as it always had, but its protection had been reaffirmed, its sanctity defended by one who understood its true value. David made one final check of the grounds, his eyes catching the glint of his Air Force pin in the morning sun. The wings reflected the light, sending a brief flash across the plaza, a reminder that though his days in the cockpit were over, his duty to protect and serve had never really ended. The next few days at WWII Memorial Plaza passed quietly, with David maintaining his usual routine of maintenance and greeting visitors. But there was a subtle change in the atmosphere, a heightened awareness that came from knowing that the peace of this sacred place had been challenged and defended. Word of the confrontation had spread through the veteran community, passed along in hushed conversations and respectful nods. Visitors to the memorial began to notice something different about the elderly caretaker. The way he moved, the quiet authority in his bearing, the sharp alertness in his eyes that spoke of battles fought both in the air and on the ground. On this particular morning, David stood before the Wall of Valor, carefully cleaning the glass that protected photographs of aerial combat missions. His reflection mingled with the black and white images of F-4 Phantoms and early model F-15s, bridging the gap between past and present. "Mr. Mitchell?" a young voice called out behind him. The boy looked up from his notebook, sensing the importance of the moment. "Is that what you were thinking about when you fought those bikers?" David's expression softened. "I was thinking about all the men and women who gave their lives so that others could live in peace. About how their memory deserves to be protected, not just from physical threats, but from disrespect and forgetfulness." David turned to find a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, standing there with a notebook in hand. The boy's earnest expression and respectful demeanor caught David's attention. "I'm doing a school project on the Air Force," the boy continued, "and my grandfather told me I should talk to you. He said you were some kind of ace pilot." David smiled slightly, setting down his cleaning supplies. "Your grandfather exaggerates. I just did my job, like everyone else whose names are on these walls." "But is it true what they're saying?" the boy pressed. "About how you protected the memorial from those bikers? My dad said you took on like 20 guys by yourself." "Stories tend to grow in the telling," David replied, but his eyes took on a distant look. "What matters isn't the number of opponents or the outcome of the fight. What matters is understanding why some places, some memories, are worth protecting." The boy nodded eagerly, pen poised over his notebook. "My grandfather was Air Force too. He says being a pilot isn't just about flying planes, it's about something more." "Your grandfather is a wise man," David said, gesturing for the boy to follow him. They walked along the memorial wall, past photographs and plaques that told stories of courage and sacrifice. "You see, in the air, everything becomes clear. There's no room for pretense, no place for false bravado. You either have what it takes, or you don't." David paused at a particular photograph, one showing a formation of F-15s against a sunset sky. Every pilot in this picture knew that each mission could be their last, but they flew anyway because they believed in something bigger than themselves. The boy scribbled frantically in his notebook, trying to capture every word. "Is that why you still come here every day? To remember them?" "I come here," David said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "because someone needs to stand guard. Someone needs to ensure that their sacrifice is respected, their memory preserved. Sometimes that means cleaning plaques and arranging flowers. And sometimes it means fighting?" the boy suggested, eyes wide with understanding. David shook his head slightly. "Sometimes it means standing up for what's right, in whatever form that takes. Those bikers? They weren't bad people, not really. They just needed to be reminded that some places deserve reverence, not rebellion." The morning sun streamed through the memorial's high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. David watched as a group of visitors entered the plaza, their voices automatically dropping to respectful whispers as they took in the solemnity of the space. "You know what the hardest part of being a pilot was?" David asked, turning back to the boy. "It wasn't the combat or the G-forces or even the fear. It was understanding the responsibility that came with the power we wielded. Every decision, every action, had consequences." They reached the end of the wall, where a large photograph showed a squadron of pilots standing proudly before their aircraft. David's finger traced the image, remembering faces and names from years past. "Your school project," David said, turning to face the boy directly, "shouldn't just be about the planes we flew or the battles we fought. It should be about why we fought them, about the principles we defended, the values we protected." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding dawning in his young face. "It's about honor, isn't it? About standing up for what's right." "Exactly," David replied, a note of approval in his voice. "Whether you're 40,000 feet in the air or right here on the ground, those principles remain the same. Courage, integrity, service before self. They're not just words on a wall. They're a way of life." The morning light had strengthened, now illuminating the memorial in a warm glow that seemed to bring the photographs and plaques to life. David stood tall, his reflection in the glass merging with the images of young pilots from decades past, a living bridge between their sacrifice and the future they had died to protect. As the days passed, David noticed subtle changes in the way the memorial was treated by visitors. Word had spread about the confrontation, and people began approaching the plaza with a heightened sense of respect. Even the usual groups of rowdy teenagers who sometimes passed through now walked with measured steps, their voices hushed as they caught sight of the veteran caretaker. One cloudy morning, as David was adjusting the fresh flowers near the central monument, he heard the now familiar rumble of motorcycles approaching. His muscles tensed instinctively, combat-honed reflexes preparing for another confrontation. But this time, the sound was different, more controlled, respectful. 3 motorcycles pulled into the parking area, their riders cutting their engines immediately. David watched as they dismounted, his tactical mind automatically assessing them. But these weren't members of Razor's gang. These riders wore clean leather jackets with military patches, genuine ones, earned through service rather than purchased, for show. The lead rider, a man about David's age with silver hair visible beneath his helmet, approached slowly. His walk had the distinctive gait of someone who had spent significant time in uniform, and the patches on his jacket identified him as a Vietnam-era pilot. "Mr. Mitchell," the man called out, stopping at a respectful distance. "I'm Jack Thompson. Used to fly Phantoms out of Da Nang. Word's been going around about what happened here last week." David nodded in acknowledgement, noting the genuine respect in the man's voice. "News travels fast in the veteran community." "That it does," Jack agreed, removing his riding gloves. "My group, the Veterans Riders Association, we've been hearing stories about some punks causing trouble at memorials across the state. When we heard about what happened here, about how one Air Force vet stood his ground," he paused, a look of admiration crossing his weathered face. "Well, we thought it was time we paid our respects, both to those on these walls and to their guardian." David's posture relaxed slightly, recognizing kindred spirits in these riders. "The memorial's open to all who understand its significance," he said, gesturing toward the entrance. The 3 riders moved through the plaza with the quiet reverence of men who understood the weight of sacrifice. They stopped at various points, paying their respects to fallen comrades, sharing quiet words about missions long past. David watched them, remembering his own squadron mates, the ones who never made it home. "You know," Jack said, returning to where David stood, "what you did here, standing up to those thugs. It reminds us that the fight to protect what matters doesn't end when we take off the uniform." David's hand rested on a nearby plaque, his fingers tracing the engraved letters of a name he had known in combat. "Some battles are fought in the air," he replied quietly, "and some are fought right here on the ground. The principle remains the same, standing up for what's right." The other 2 riders joined them, their expressions solemn. One of them, wearing patches that identified him as a Desert Storm veteran, spoke up. "We're starting a program, sir. Veterans patrolling memorial sites, making sure they're treated with proper respect. Would mean a lot to have someone like you involved." David considered the offer, his tactical mind already analyzing the possibilities. It was another kind of mission, different from the high-speed combat he once knew, but no less important. "The younger generation," Jack added, "they need to see that these places matter, that the sacrifices made by those whose names are on these walls still mean something. Your stand against those bikers? That sent a message louder than any lecture could." The morning light filtered through the memorial's windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. David thought about the young student who had interviewed him, about the impact one moment of standing firm could have on future generations. "When I was flying combat missions," David said, his voice taking on the tone he once used in mission briefings, "we always knew our ground crews had our backs. Maybe now it's time for us to return the favor, to watch over the places where our fallen brothers and sisters are remembered." Jack nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in David's words. "Different kind of mission, same dedication to duty." "The thing about aerial combat," David continued, moving toward the Wall of Honor, "is that you learn to see the bigger picture. From 40,000 feet, you understand that every action has consequences, that every stand you take matters." The veterans followed him, their boots making soft sounds on the marble floor. They stopped before a section of the wall dedicated to Vietnam-era pilots, where Jack reached out to touch a name he recognized. "We're not asking you to leave your post here," Jack said quietly. "But your experience, your dedication, it could help us protect other memorials, train other volunteers, show them what it really means to stand guard over sacred ground." David studied the wall of photographs, images of young pilots standing proudly before their aircraft, many of whom never returned from their final missions. Each name, each face, represented a story of courage, of sacrifice, of dedication to something greater than themselves. "Count me in," David said finally, his voice firm with decision. "These places, these memories, they deserve nothing less than our complete commitment to their protection." The veterans exchanged knowing looks, recognizing, in David's words, the same dedication they had once given to their combat missions. The memorial stood silent around them, its walls bearing witness to another generation stepping up to ensure that sacrifice would never be forgotten. As weeks passed, WWII Memorial Plaza had become more than just a place of remembrance. It had transformed into a symbol of protected legacy. David's daily routine now included not only maintaining the memorial, but also training other veterans in the art of respectful vigilance. The incident with Razor's gang had sparked something larger, a movement among veterans to ensure that sacred spaces remained untouched by disrespect. On this particular morning, David stood at the entrance, watching a group of veteran riders conducting their first patrol. Jack Thompson had made good on his promise, establishing a network of guardians who understood the deeper meaning of their mission. The rumble of their motorcycles, once a source of tension, now brought a sense of security to the memorial grounds. "Quite a change from a few weeks ago," James Cooper remarked, joining David at his observation post. "Who'd have thought one confrontation would lead to all this?" David's eyes tracked the patrol's movement, noting their professional bearing and respectful demeanor. "Sometimes it takes a spark to light a bigger fire, Chief. These men and women, they were just waiting for someone to show them it could be done." The morning sun caught the polished stone of the memorial walls, creating a warm glow that seemed to animate the names and faces preserved there. David had noticed more visitors lately, drawn perhaps by the stories circulating about the memorials, protection, or maybe by a renewed appreciation for what these walls represented. "Got some interesting news," James said, his voice lowering slightly. "Remember Razor, the leader of that gang that caused all the trouble?" David turned, his attention sharpening. "What about him?" "Word is, he's been asking around about you. Not looking for trouble this time, though. Apparently, he's been trying to track down his old man's military records. Turns out his father was Air Force, died in combat when Razor was just a kid." David absorbed this information with the same careful consideration he once gave to mission intelligence. "Sometimes people lash out at the things they don't understand," he said finally. "Or the things that remind them of pain they haven't dealt with." A group of schoolchildren entered the plaza, their teacher guiding them toward the educational displays. David watched as they moved through the space, their young faces turned up in wonder at the photographs and medals, their voices naturally hushing in response to the memorial's solemnity. "You know," James continued, "some of the other memorial sites have reported similar incidents, troublemakers backing down when they realize these places are being watched over by veterans who care. Your stand here, it's having ripple effects." David nodded, remembering his days as a flight instructor. "In aerial combat, we learned that one successful strategy could change the outcome of many future engagements. Same principle applies here." The veteran riders had completed their patrol and were gathering near the entrance. Their leather jackets now bore new patches, symbols of their commitment to protecting these sacred spaces. David had helped design the insignia himself, incorporating elements that spoke of vigilance, honor, and respect. "Eagle Eye," one of the riders called out, approaching with a crisp military bearing. "We've got reports from the Washington Memorial. They're requesting some guidance on setting up their own protection detail." David straightened, his posture automatically shifting into command mode. "Tell them we'll send a team next week. They need to understand this isn't about showing force. It's about showing respect." The morning had fully bloomed now, the memorial grounds alive with visitors. David watched as veterans and civilians alike moved through the space, each finding their own connection to the stories preserved within these walls. The atmosphere had changed since the confrontation. There was a new awareness, a deeper appreciation for what this place represented. "You ever miss it?" James asked suddenly. "The flying, the combat, the clear-cut missions?" David's gaze swept across the plaza, taking in the protected names, the preserved memories, the living history under his guard. "Every day," he admitted. "But this mission, protecting these memories, ensuring these sacrifices are respected, it's just as important as any combat operation I ever flew." A father and son paused before the wall of valor, the man pointing out specific aircraft in the photographs, sharing stories of his own service. David watched their interaction, seeing in it the passing of history from one generation to the next. "Besides," he continued, "the principles remain the same. Situational. Awareness, tactical thinking, dedication to the mission. The battlefield's different, but the warrior spirit isn't." The veteran riders were mounting up, preparing to move on to their next patrol. Each of them nodded respectfully to David as they passed, acknowledging the man who had shown them that standing watch over sacred ground was a mission worthy of their skills and dedication. "The thing about being a pilot," David said, watching them depart, "is that you learn to see patterns from above. You start to understand how small actions can have large consequences. What happened here with Razor's gang? That was just the beginning. There's a bigger mission now, and these walls are just the first line we're defending." The sun was setting over WWII Memorial Plaza, casting long shadows across the polished stones and creating a golden glow that seemed to bring the memorial walls to life. David stood at his usual post, completing his final rounds for the day, when an unexpected visitor caught his attention. It was Razor, alone this time, without his gang or his usual aggressive demeanor. He approached slowly, almost hesitantly, his leather jacket missing the provocative patches that had adorned it during their confrontation. Something about his bearing had changed, the artificial toughness replaced by what appeared to be genuine uncertainty. "Mr. Mitchell," Razor called out, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "Got a minute?" David turned to face him, his combat-trained senses automatically assessing for threats but finding none. This was a different man from the one who had led the gang attack weeks ago. "I've been doing some thinking," Razor continued, stopping a respectful distance away. "About what happened here. About what you said regarding sacrifice and respect." He paused, struggling with words that seemed foreign to him. "And about my father." David remained silent, allowing the younger man to find his way through what was clearly a difficult conversation. The evening light painted the memorial in shades of amber and gold, creating an atmosphere that seemed to encourage truth-telling. "Found his name," Razor said finally, gesturing toward the memorial walls. "James Harrison, Captain, United States. Air Force. Shot down over enemy territory in '89. I was 5 when it happened." Understanding dawned in David's eyes. The name was familiar. He had polished that particular plaque countless times, never knowing its connection to the man who had tried to desecrate this very ground. "Your father flew F-16s, David said quietly. He was known for his skill in low-altitude operations. Saved his entire squadron during a particularly hairy mission over hostile territory. Razor's head snapped up, surprise evident in his features. "You knew him?" "Not personally," David replied, moving toward the section of wall where Captain Harrison's name was engraved. "But in the Air Force, we all knew about that mission. His sacrifice allowed 3 other pilots to make it home to their families." The 2 men stood before the memorial wall, the former adversaries now united in a moment of shared respect. Razor's hand reached out, fingers tracing his father's name with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his tough exterior. "I spent years being angry," Razor admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Angry at the Air Force for taking him, angry at him for leaving, angry at these memorials for reminding me of what I lost. That's why He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "That's why you tried to prove these walls didn't matter," David finished for him. "Sometimes it's easier to reject something than to face the pain it represents." Razor nodded, withdrawing his hand from the plaque. "When you stopped us that day, when you showed us what real strength looks like, it made me think about him, about what he stood for, about what I've become." The plaza had grown quiet, the last visitors of the day having departed. Only the soft whisper of the evening breeze disturbed the silence, carrying with it the weight of memory and regret. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Razor said firmly. "What we did here was wrong, and I know that now. But I thought you should know. I'm disbanding the gang. Some of us were thinking about using our bikes differently, maybe joining those veteran riders who protect places like this." David studied the younger man, seeing in him the potential for change that he had recognized in countless young pilots during his years as an instructor. "Your father would be proud of that decision," he said simply. "I don't deserve to wear the same patches as those riders," Razor responded, shaking his head. "Not after what we did here." "Redemption isn't about deserving," David replied, his voice carrying the same authority he had once used to guide nervous pilots through their first combat missions. "It's about choosing to be better, about standing up for what's right, even especially when, it's difficult." The last rays of sunlight filtered through the memorial's windows, casting long shadows across the floor. In that moment, both men stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about legacy, honor, and the choices that define us. "Your father understood something that took me years to learn," David said finally. "That true strength isn't about domination or fear. It's about protecting what matters, about standing up for principles bigger than ourselves." Razor nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. "I'd like to learn more about him, about what he did, about why this place meant so much to him." "Then come back tomorrow," David offered. "I'll show you his mission records, tell you the stories that every pilot in the Air Force knew about Captain Harrison. But more importantly, I'll show you why these walls, these memories, are worth protecting." As the evening settled over WWII Memorial Plaza, a new understanding had been forged between the unlikely pair, the veteran guardian and the reformed troublemaker, both finding their way toward honoring a legacy that had been waiting to be rediscovered. The morning sun rose over WWII Memorial Plaza, finding David at his usual post. But today felt different. The plaza had transformed over the past months, becoming more than just a memorial. It had become a symbol of protected legacy and redemption. The veteran riders patrolled regularly, Razor and his reformed gang members now among them, each wearing the guardian patches they had earned through dedication and respect. David watched as a group of visitors moved through the plaza, noting how they carried themselves with a reverence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing week. The story of the confrontation had evolved into something larger, a tale about standing up for what matters, about the power of remembrance, and about the possibility of change. Quite a sight, isn't it? James Cooper appeared beside him, gesturing toward where Razor stood near his father's plaque, sharing stories with a group of young visitors. From gang leader to memorial guardian. Never thought I'd see the day. David nodded, remembering his own transformation from combat pilot to protector of memories. "Sometimes the best missions aren't the ones we plan for, Chief. They're the ones that find us when we're ready for them." The plaza had become a different kind of cockpit for David, a space where he could continue serving, protecting, teaching. The skills that had once guided him through combat missions now helped him guard these sacred memories, train new guardians, and ensure that the sacrifices remembered here would never be forgotten. "Got some news you might be interested in," James said. pulling out a folder. Remember those reports about troublemakers at other memorials? Since we started the Guardian program, incidents have dropped by 80% across the state. Other veterans groups are asking about implementing similar programs. David took the folder, scanning its contents with the same attention he once gave to mission briefings. It's spreading beyond just memorial protection now, he noted. Veterans finding new ways to serve, new missions to accomplish. A motorcycle rumbled in the distance, a single bike approaching with measured respect. Jack Thompson pulled into the parking area, his leather jacket now bearing additional patches marking him as a regional coordinator for the Memorial Guardian program. "Eagle Eye," Jack called out as he approached. "Got some new recruits waiting for orientation at the Air Force Memorial. They specifically requested you as their instructor." David smiled slightly, remembering his days training young pilots. Different. Venue, same principles, teaching them to protect what matters, to understand why these places deserve our dedication. The morning light caught the memorial walls, bringing the names and photographs to life. David's eyes were drawn to Captain Harrison's plaque, where Razor continued his impromptu tour. The young man's voice carried across the plaza, sharing stories of courage and sacrifice with a passion that would have seemed impossible just months ago. "You know," James mused, following David's gaze, "when you stood up to those bikers that day, you weren't just protecting a memorial. You were showing them a different path, whether you meant to or not." David nodded, understanding the truth in those words. "In the air, we learned that sometimes the best way to win isn't to destroy your opponent, but to make them see things differently, to help them understand what really matters." The plaza had filled with more visitors now, including a group of Air Force cadets on a training visit. They moved through the space with measured steps, their young faces serious as they absorbed the weight of the legacy surrounding them. "Ready for another mission, Eagle Eye?" Jack asked, gesturing toward his bike. "Those recruits won't train themselves." David took one last look around the plaza, at the protected walls, the respectful visitors, the transformed lives. The memorial stood as it always had, but now it was more than just a place of remembrance. It had become a beacon of hope, a symbol of redemption, and a testament to the enduring power of standing up for what's right. "The thing about being a pilot," David said as he prepared to leave with Jack, "is that you learn to recognize when you're exactly where you need to be, doing exactly what you need to do. This mission, protecting these memories, teaching others to do the same, this is where I belong now." As they mounted their bikes, David caught a glimpse of his reflection. In the memorial's polished stone, the young combat pilot he had once been seemed to merge with the guardian he had become, creating something new, a protector of both physical spaces and sacred memories, a teacher of respect and honor, a living bridge between the sacrifices of the past and the promise of the future. The bikes roared to life, but with a respectful rumble that spoke of understanding rather than defiance. As they pulled away from Victory Memorial Plaza, David knew that while his days of aerial combat were behind him, his mission to protect and serve had never truly ended. It had simply found a new form, a new purpose, and a new generation of warriors to train. The memorial stood silent in the morning sun, its walls containing countless stories of courage and sacrifice. But now it held one more story, a tale of transformation, of standing ground, and of finding new ways to honor the legacy of those who had given everything for something greater than themselves. This type appears to be a request for part 13 of the story. I'll summarize the story's ending, with a final resolution, maintaining the same tone and writing style as previous parts. The summer sun cast a golden glow across Victory Memorial Plaza, where David Eagle Eye Mitchell stood watching a new generation of guardians take their oath of protection. The memorial grounds had become more than just a place of remembrance. It was now a living symbol of transformation and renewed purpose. Dozens of motorcycles lined the parking area, their chrome gleaming in the morning light. Among them stood former troublemakers, turned protectors, veteran riders from across the state, and new recruits ready to carry on the legacy. Razor, now serving as a lead trainer, stood tall beside his father's plaque, the Guardian patch on his leather jacket worn with hard-earned pride. "Never thought I'd see something like this," James Cooper remarked, joining David at his observation post. A whole movement born from one man's stand against disrespect. David's eyes swept across the plaza, taking in the changes that had occurred since that fateful confrontation. The memorial walls seemed to glow with renewed purpose, each name and photograph telling stories not just of past sacrifice, but of ongoing dedication. "You know what was the hardest part about leaving the cockpit, Chief?" David asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his trademark. "It wasn't the adrenaline or the combat I missed most. It was the sense of purpose, the knowledge that what you're doing truly matters." A young recruit approached, standing at attention before David. "Sir, the new team is assembled and ready for instruction." David nodded, straightening his shoulders with the same precision he once showed before major missions. "In the air, we learned that every action has consequences, every decision matters. Down here, protecting these memories, teaching others to do the same, it's no different. The mission just takes a different form." The gathered crowd fell silent as David moved to address them. Veterans, reformed troublemakers, and new guardians alike, all united in their commitment to protecting the sacred grounds that honored America's fallen heroes. The morning light caught David's Air Force pin, sending a familiar flash across the plaza. "When I first started watching over this memorial," David began, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "I thought I was just guarding stone and metal. But what we protect here isn't just physical. We're guarding memories, sacrifices, and the very principles that make these walls worth defending." The faces before him showed understanding. They had all found their way here for different reasons, but now shared a common purpose. From Razor's reformed gang to veteran riders from across the country, each had discovered their own way to serve. Eagle. "I, Mitchell," Jack Thompson said, stepping forward with a new patch, one that marked David as the head instructor of the Guardian program. "You showed us that some battles are worth fighting on the ground, just as much as in the air. That standing, up for what's right, never truly ends." As David accepted the patch, his mind flashed back to that first confrontation, to the moment he realized that his fighting days weren't over. They had just found a new purpose. The memorial still stood as it always had, but now it had a new layer of meaning, a new story of redemption and renewal. "The skills that kept us alive in combat," David addressed the crowd. "The dedication that drove us to protect our nation, those same qualities serve us here. Whether you're a veteran finding a new way to serve, or someone who's found their way here seeking purpose, remember this. What we do here matters. Every stand we take, every memory we protect, every life we help transform, it all matters." The sea. Morning sun had risen fully now, bathing the memorial in warm light. The names on the walls seemed to shine brighter, as if acknowledging this new chapter in their eternal watch. David "Eagle Eye" Mitchell, once a warrior of the skies, had found his final mission. Not just protecting these sacred spaces, but ensuring that others would carry on that protection for generations to come. As the new guardians took their positions around the plaza, David stood watching, his posture straight, his eyes alert. He wasn't just a retired Air Force pilot anymore, nor simply a memorial caretaker. He had become something more, a bridge between past and present, a guardian of memories, a teacher of respect, and a living reminder that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with unwavering dedication to what matters most. The legacy of WWII Memorial Plaza had grown beyond its walls, spreading across the country, touching lives and transforming souls. And at its heart stood David Mitchell, still standing watch, still protecting what mattered, still showing others the way. The warrior spirit that had once guided him through aerial combat now served a different mission, one that would ensure that the sacrifices honored here would never be forgotten, and the sacred ground upon which they stood would always be protected.